Hi, I'm Jack Howell. If you needed proof that I'm not making videos for the algorithm, look no further. Musicians, the analytics say, do not watch rhythm videos. I think that's because we all think our own rhythm is great, and it's a feel, it's personal, so we hate having it corrected. Nevertheless, I keep making rhythm videos because I spend so much time teaching rhythm and looking for different ways to explain it. And it's kind of low-hanging fruit. It is a significant opportunity if we are willing to examine and improve our rhythmic feel because so many people are unwilling to do so. In the comment section of a previous rhythm video that almost nobody watched, there was a discussion about a metronome tuner app, namely the Tonal Energy Tuner. In that video, I suggested using a metronome with a very slow pulse, 1 beat per bar or 1 beat per 2 bars, to build the ability to anticipate the approaching beat rather than react to the previous one. And it was said that the TE tuner's function of randomly emitting beats would do the same thing. So I bought the TE tuner app, and it has solidified my attitude toward metronome apps. And if I didn't lose you at metronome, you're probably a maniac like me, so let's get into this. I used the TE Tuner app to practice. I watched tutorials on using its advanced features. I pushed lots of buttons, and I'm convinced this app will do everything but scratch your back. With this app, you can program an entire passage, even an entire movement, with all the meter and subdivision changes, even tempo changes. There is a voice feature so the metronome will shout the meter at you. So all you have to do is play with the metronome, and you'll play the most complex rhythmic passage perfectly. Right? Right? Well, I don't know. It makes me wonder, with such advanced metronomes, why isn't great rhythm more common? I know you have great rhythm, we established that, but sit on one audition committee and you'll hear exactly what I'm talking about. Listen to college entrance auditions and you'll hear it even more plainly. Listen to youth orchestra auditions and it's pretty much all you'll hear. You'd think with these oscillation overthruster metronomes, bad rhythm would have been wiped off the face of the earth by now. I'm going to give someone a doctoral thesis here for free. Run an experiment comparing before and after rhythmic accuracy and tempo stability when performing a set of orchestral excerpts. I would suggest Schubert Unfinished, Firebird Variation, Beethoven 6th Second Movement. Now, what the test students will do is that they will A, practice with a metronome on a slow pulse, B, with an oscillation overthruster metronome on maximum subdivision and random beat dropping, and C, no metronome. Analyze the before and after samples in Pro Tools or Logic Pro. Drop me a line, I've got the experiment designed. I think you'll find that the slow metronome results in better rhythmic accuracy and a better ability to hold a steady tempo than the turbo subdivision. Now, why do I think that? Well, let's look at some metronomes. And let's look at what a metronome does and really think about it, not just on a chronistic level, but on a philosophical level. A metronome is a central fact of life for a classical musician. Isn't it worth a little time to really think about it? If you're my age, this will be a walk down memory lane. If you're younger than, say, this metronome, come back with me to a time when if you were running late, you had to pull over at a payphone and put a dime in it to make a call using a phone number that you had stored in your brain. This was a time when metronomes only did one thing. It may take a few minutes, but it may also make the difference to your rhythm that wins you a job. So, is a metronome essential to music? At a fundamental level, no. Music and rhythm existed for thousands of years before notation, never mind metronomes. Orchestral music that depended on a steady pulse existed for centuries before metronomes. Quantz talks about holding a steady beat by tapping your foot and establishing tempo by referring to your own heartbeat. Before metronomes, this was a skill to be developed. Musicians were simply expected to develop it. Then, eventually, along came the metronome. Metronome development basically follows behind the clock. Galileo's discovery of the isochronism of pendulums around 1600 made possible the development of the pendulum clock, which came about 50 years later with the work of Christian Huygens. This wasn't the first clock. Humans created various timekeeping devices like water clocks and sundials and hourglasses in antiquity. And the first escapement mechanism clocks appeared around 1300. But the pendulum greatly increased the clock's accuracy, and the pendulum's property of changing its period as it was lengthened or shortened is what enabled the first metronome-like devices, beginning apparently around 1694 with an invention by French musician Etienne L'Huillier. L'Huillier's metronome and others like it had some problems. They didn't actually make a sound, didn't have a great form factor, and they were more of a scientific instrument than a musical tool. Just to put this on a timeline, Bach would have had a clock at some point in his life, but not a metronome. His tempi, like most in classical music, were rooted in everyday life: walking, the heartbeat, the different gaits of a horse, multiples or fractions of other tempi derived by meter. Haydn, who was fond of and collected clocks, had no metronome. Take his Symphony No. 101, The Clock, from 1793 or 94. No metronome markings, but there is no doubt what the second movement tempo should be, despite the indication of andante. It wasn't until 1814 that the German inventor Dietrich Nikolaus Winkel developed a musical chronometer that looked basically the same as this, a pyramidal box with a swinging arm and a sliding weight. But he failed to patent it. In 1816, Johann Nepomuk Melzel, and if you're looking for a rabbit hole, search Mechanical Turk, copied Winkel's design and patented it himself. Another rabbit hole is Melzel's relationship with Beethoven, to whom he gave a metronome and who became the first composer to put metronome markings in music. Beethoven's metronome basically looked like this. This one actually belongs to my wife. She used it herself as a child. And this kind of metronome, looking back on it, had much to recommend it. It needed no batteries, and I think the swinging weight gave a much better sense of flow between beats than the blinking LED that followed it. On the downside, they weren't necessarily accurate. Lots of people think that Beethoven's metronome was pretty far off, and as they got old and worn, they tended to get a little wonky and unsteady, kind of like people. They weren't very portable, a problem that was eased by these mini metronomes. I used this one in high school, and maybe as you can tell, it has gotten a little wonky. Now, if you're the doctoral dissertation person, maybe work the pendulum metronome into your experiment. This is a newer one that I got because we'll talk about it later. This one's actually pretty steady. So here we have a metronome that Beethoven would have recognized. It gave a regular beat, it gave tempo and number. It quantified rhythm in the same way that the clock quantified time. By establishing beats per minute as a thing, the metronome allowed tempi to be set precisely and repeatably, and to be communicated as part of musical notation. So, a steady beat, a tempo number. Whether or not we pay attention to it is a separate matter, but for the musician practicing alone, the metronome serves as a surrogate for the ensemble. It gives us a measure of our ability to hold a steady tempo all the way through a piece of music, rather than speeding up the easy parts and slowing down the hard parts. If you're always playing with other people, like, say, the Beatles did, a metronome is unnecessary. It's those of us who spend thousands of hours alone learning concerti and orchestral music who need a rhythm buddy. Putting the two things together, the metronome gave us tempo increments, which gave us an objective measure of progress. Last week we could only play this passage cleanly at 80. This week it's at 84. Perhaps next week it will be at 92. Increments allow us to detect progress that might otherwise go unnoticed. This is super important for stuff like articulation, and increments allow us to build precision and skill by starting a complex piece at a tempo slower than other humans might be willing to play, and to speed up more gradually than we might if we just played faster and faster until we fell apart. Never underestimate the power of the increment. Here is my next formative metronome. I bought this one on eBay out of sheer nostalgia. The way it works is pretty ingenious. It's the same principle as a continuously variable transmission. Inside there is an electric motor spinning a parabolic cone. This pointer lever is attached to a pivoting arm that holds a wheel against the cone. So the wheel triggers a mechanical click and an electrical pulse for the light. There we go. So at the outside of the cone, the diameter is large, so the wheel makes few clicks. The alternating current coming out of the wall in the US is supposed to be 60 cycles per second, which regulates the speed of the motor. More or less, but close enough. So that's maybe not as intuitive as a pendulum, but still understandable. Where were we? Okay, increments. In high school band, each year was divided into marching band and concert band. And boy, I hated marching band. During concert season, our band director, Hampton Wines, a retired Air Force trumpet player, had one goal: to get a 1 rating at district contest. And we did. We never got a 2 or a 3 because we understood that if that happened, the world would end. So every Wednesday after school during concert band season, we had a mandatory 2-hour clarinet sectional. Every section had a different day. We would sit in a semicircle around Hamp, who sat this very model of Bakelite Franz flash beat metronome on a stool in front of him. We would play war horse transcriptions for contest, Trike 4, Poet and Peasant, Russian Sailor's Dance. We would start at the slowest tempo, which was 40 beats per minute. Hamp didn't really care much about expression, but he cared deeply about accuracy. So we would play a passage at the slowest tempo until the whole section could play it perfectly 3 times. Then he would move the pointer up 1 click. If we played the passage perfectly 3 times, he would move it up 1 click, and so on. If anybody made a mistake, the pointer went all the way back to 40. No second chances. I remember Tchaikovsky 4 had to go at 144, and I can remember wanting to jump out a window when we would claw our way all the way to 138 and somebody would miss a note. I can't imagine that kids or parents would stand for that today, but it taught me the power of the increment and the importance of having stakes in practice. This was a small logging town. I was one of only 2 clarinet players who took lessons from the one woodwind teacher in town who taught all the woodwinds. He was a great guy, a fine musician. He was an oboist, actually. That's another story. The band was made up mostly of loggers' kids and mill workers' kids, longshoremen's kids. Not that mill workers and loggers didn't provide good lives for their families. Private music lessons just weren't really a thing. And Hamp got this band playing difficult music flawlessly at brisk tempi with basically no tools except 2 hours a week, fear of failure, and that big electric metronome. The main advantage this brick had over the wind-up metronome was conspicuity, not needing to be wound up. It was loud, like a temple block, and had this flashing light. This one is basically worn out, and it isn't very loud and very accurate. But I keep it in my studio to take students back with me to 1980 in a hot band room after school and make the point that if you have the patience to do simple things perfectly and are willing to accept incremental progress, you can play anything. That metronome, though, it only did one thing, and that's also true of this Seiko, which I used my first 2 or 3 years in college. It was a great metronome. Had good sound. There's no battery in it now. Durable, good battery life. The speaker wore out, so it's barely audible. And it's probably my last metronome that didn't have a volume control. It's a quartz metronome, which is a technological advance worth just a minute to discuss. Okay, maybe 2 minutes. Quartz timing wasn't developed for music. It was developed for important stuff like radios and found its way into metronomes when it became cheap. Quartz crystal is piezoelectric. If you apply mechanical force to it, it will emit electrons. If you apply electricity to it, it will vibrate at a very specific frequency. In devices using quartz crystals for timing, a very small, very precisely sized wafer of cultured quartz crystal is sandwiched between electrodes that apply a tiny amount of electricity, causing the wafer to vibrate at a very, very high frequency. The smaller the wafer, the higher the frequency, like up to 200 megahertz. Obviously, if you divide 1 second into 200 million segments, that's pretty accurate. Then there's a computer that counts these oscillations and makes something happen, every so many million of them. All of this is contained in a chip, which dictates the size of the wafer. A wafer of 1 millimeter by 2 millimeters has a resonant frequency of about 20 megahertz. And I guess that's about where we are. That's probably a chip right there. Plenty accurate. And this is the engine room for standalone metronomes up to today. So here's where things changed. The Boss Doctor beat. And this is what happened when designers figured out you could make lots of stuff happen by counting oscillations. I remember when this thing hit and being flabbergasted at these sliders, which you could use to set practically any subdivision. And I spent hours, who wouldn't wind up with perfect rhythm if you practice with this? Lots of people, it turned out. I spent, let's see, where is it, 70? Yeah, the sliders are worn out, so you can't hear the triplets. I spent hours practicing Firebird variation with the triplet subdivision, and it didn't actually help. Bill would still yell at me. Audition committees would still ask me to play it again, paying particular attention to the rhythm. In an audition, the committee isn't just listening to the notes for rhythm, they're listening to the rests. And the more impulses you feel per bar, the more your tempo will drift. What did help was when I turned off the downbeat. I turned everything off except for the downbeat clink. Which for a metronome marking of 76 gave a beat of roughly 25, which no previous metronome had been capable of. And this is where I think, with this metronome, I think this is where two paths diverged in a wood. It turns out I have lots of metronomes. I bought some because they were smaller, or they combined a tuner and a metronome. I carry one like this in my case. Actually, I think I carry a TM60, which I can't show you because it's packed in the carnet. And the TM60 has some cool features, including a sound back feature. If you use headphones, the tuner will track your pitch and play the same pitch back to you in equal temperament, so you can hear where your pitch should be. It's not perfectly in tune with just intonation, but for many students it's a starting point for listening and matching pitch. Here is a truly great metronome. In my opinion, this is the best electronic metronome ever. It's loud. It will go from 1 beat per minute to 999 beats per minute. It was made by Jonathan Parks, who played English horn in the Rochester Philharmonic. It's a really great piece of design and manufacturing. I wore the thumb wheels out once, and Mr. Parks very kindly came out of metronome making retirement to fix it for me. I'm hoping to get through my career before wearing it out again. It does have an emphasis beat feature. You can set a tink on beats 1 through 9. Other miscellaneous metronomes. I bought this one because it's made in England. I thought that was cool, but it doesn't go very slow, and it's not very loud. It's hard to change the battery, and the battery life isn't very good, which is something to consider. when choosing a metronome. At some point I started using rechargeable batteries, which I encourage and only makes sense. In-a-loop Pro are the best for AA and AAA. For 9-volt, the ones you can just plug into a micro computer cord are very convenient. This is a pretty good metronome. It's got a nice speaker, good sound, but it uses 4 AA batteries, and it doesn't have great battery life. And it isn't very portable. It's kind of a weird shape. This one I carry for teaching and coaching because I regard my parks to be too valuable to leave anywhere but home, and it's not super portable anyway. While I absolutely hate and am personally morally opposed to using a metronome when I'm playing with a chamber group, sometimes, especially with student groups, you have to establish a baseline, something everyone will acknowledge is right. And with this nice big speaker, this one is loud enough. I wish it went slower. The little ones they're just not loud enough. They're barely loud enough for one instrument. An exception is this one here, a Boss DB60. It's pretty loud, not too big. What it's really good for is the acid test drill because it's instant on. The beat starts exactly when you push play, and that's handy. I also have a Peterson strobe tuner and metronome. I meant to bring it up. It's really fancy. The tuner's good. The pitch generator is loud, has a wide range. It's supposed to be very advanced and have settings for just intonation in various keys, but I've never used that feature. I mostly use the pitch generator. I figure if you can't hear it, what good does it do to see it? The metronome is fine and also supposedly very sophisticated and programmable. It displays tempi in tenths of a beat, which is more of a pain than anything. You do occasionally see modern music with metronome markings of decimal points. I suppose if there's a MIDI track somewhere, the software generates the metronome markings automatically. In fact, I think that's MIDI compatible. It's basically state of the art in a standalone metronome. Which brings us to apps. I think I've got 2 or 3 of them on my phone, the latest and most advanced being the TE tuner that set me off on this rant. There's convenience in having a metronome on your phone along with everything else. And that's why I have metronome apps. Sometimes I don't have a metronome, but I always have my phone. However, many students now only have metronome apps. They don't own a standalone metronome. My first problem with this is that it makes it impossible to turn the phone off when practicing, and there is no greater destroyer of attention spans than the cell phone. I'm pretty sure some of my students consider it completely unreasonable that I ask them to spend money on something that they could have on their phones for free, or that I ask them to turn their phones OFF off when practicing. But it's not just me being old and cranky to say that decreased attention span degrades learning. And if there's a tricky rhythm, I want students to figure it out, not program it into a metronome app. Which brings me to my second problem, which is actually serious. I'd like someone to name one thing where having a computer do that thing for us has made us better at it. We feel rhythm. I think of a t-shirt I saw that said, "I can explain it to you, but I can't understand it for you." A metronome can play rhythm to us, but it can't understand or feel it for us. Just because a metronome emits a detailed subdivision or meter change doesn't mean that we're going to feel or play it accurately, or that if we do, we'll be able to reproduce it with the metronome off. And it's unmusical. Maybe you can listen to an app yell 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and not start reacting rather than anticipating. However, I think that for most musicians, the reverse is true. I know some of you will disagree with me, and I know that my audience at this point includes musicians who are much better than I am. Whether they stuck around, I don't know, but if you do disagree, my intention is not to argue with you. It is to present my point of view for your consideration. And some will say, and I've heard some teachers say, that having a super accurate subdivision for comparison enables students to grasp the concept quicker and play it better. And the theory sounds plausible, that if you play with an external subdivision, at some point you will absorb it, and what the metronome is doing becomes internal. If the metronome is emitting even sixteenths, your sixteenths will become even. I suppose that could happen, but as a teacher I see it rarely. More often, students learn to emphasize extra beats to coincide with the metronome, creating extra unmusical accents and ingraining the inability to play in rhythm without something to react to immediately. If you can't play an offbeat without breathing on the downbeat, I'm talking to you. Or they ignore the metronome entirely, and the more clicks per bar, the more likely something will line up accidentally. I can't tell you how many times when I ask a student to demonstrate playing with a metronome, they will pull out their phones, start a bika chika, bika chika, get a really fancy subdivision going, and then can play completely out of rhythm with it. And if you're a teacher, you're probably nodding your head. And if you want to practice meter or tempo changes in a piece of music, why not simply play along with a good recording of the piece of music? Then you get the phrasing and harmony too. With technology, you can slow recordings down without changing the pitch. Now, right there, that's useful. I'll give you that. With all these subdivisions, maybe the worst case is when a talented player gets really good at reacting to small beats. So good that when you hear that player alone, you think they've got really good rhythm. But because they have just gotten good at following, they're never exactly with the ensemble. And there's no playing with them because they are always following, reacting, and adjusting. Here's the best thing I think you can do with the metronome. Put it on a big beat. The bigger the better. You want to feel the pulse, not react to the beat. I admit sometimes I use the triple digits for eighths or sixteenths to check accuracy in mixed and changing meters. But I'm still anticipating the bar, not reacting to the little notes. The next best thing you can do with the metronome is put it on the offbeat. Put it on half note, 2 and 4. In my opinion, we should use the metronome to train our feel, not as a substitute for it. You should subdivide for yourself. You should keep track of mixed and changing meter, not let an app do it for you. Maybe it's taken me too long to get to my point, but I guess I'm kind of hoping to convince you. If technology does something for me that I previously depended on someone else for, that's one thing. It sucked for the other guy, but I don't really miss telephone operators. However, if technology does something for me that I previously did for myself, danger, Will Robinson, danger. Also, using technology that we don't understand and can't fix. GPS navigation does not improve our sense of direction. Generative AI does not make us better writers. Google search does not make us better thinkers. And I don't think metronome apps are making us better musicians. Frankly, if you can't make it through a piece of music that alternates between 2/4 and 3/4 without an app, you have a fundamental problem. And if you don't have the patience to figure out a tricky subdivision or listen to a recording, but you do have the patience to program it into an app, I think your efforts are misdirected. So, here's my advice for what it's worth. Stop with the apps. Learn rhythms by conducting and speaking them to yourself. Learn to flow with the pulse. Feel the direction in rhythm. Listen to music and move with it. Think rhythms when you're walking. Swing on a swing and hum tunes to yourself. Play with other people and listen and move. Dance. Be creative. Be curious. Yes, use a metronome. By all means, use a metronome, but play with it. Don't program it to think for you. In fact, putting this video together led me to buy what I now consider to be the best metronome for the serious musician. I've had these little Whitners for years, and sometimes I use them. But I thought, what I really want is a really high quality version of my wife's metronome that really works. So I think the big Whitners, this is a Whitner, I think they're pretty good. But when I looked online, I saw that Yamaha makes one. This is not a sponsored video. Bought this with my own money. I've always said if Yamaha makes a dishwasher, I'll buy it. Their commitment to quality and value is simply unmatched. So sold. And it's great. Don't let the plastic case put you off. It sounds great, and I think it actually makes it louder. The only thing that keeps it from being perfect is that the gradations only go down to 40 BPM. Now it'll go a little bit slower, but slow tempo have always been an issue with pendulum metronomes. And this metronome is accurate as hell. I put it and my Parks on 84 and they stayed locked together until I got bored and figured the point was proved. So this metronome is the anti-app. It's not a disembodied emitter of clicks. It is a physical, mechanical thing that creates periodicity in a completely obvious way. Not only does it beat time, it shows you when the beat is going to happen. It invites you to anticipate the click as the arm swings. This is your rhythm buddy. Street price is about $60, and I bought this one from on Amazon. And it's a Yamaha. What else do I need to say? I've been using it. I find it reinforces the way I want to feel rhythm. I think it works on an instinctive level, and I suspect that young musicians would develop better rhythm using it. Now, your reaction to this idea may be similar to my wife's. When I explained this video concept to her, that the swinging arm teaches anticipation of the beat better than a disembodied click, she said, well, there are apps that do the same thing. It's just, it's just a line sweeping back and forth. I don't think it's the same thing. I'm sure app programming is so good and the resolution is so high that the sweeping line has exactly the same timing as a physical object obeying the laws of physics. I mean, look at video games, look at virtual reality. Of course it's exactly the same thing. But it's still a two-dimensional graphic on a flat screen. I know that people can get lost in virtual reality, but I don't think an app graphic is that involving. I think it's more likely to just be ignored. I think an actual physical object obeying the laws of physics takes a different sensory neural path. I could spin all kinds of theories, but bottom line, I just think it's better. And that's enough for me. If you're on a program of leaving no stone unturned, maybe it's enough for you. So try it yourself. Blow $60 on a Yamaha MP90 or a Whitner. Don't look for a metronome overlord. Think of the metronome like another human musician who just happens to have perfect rhythm and infinite patience. But as Dennis Miller used to say, that's just my opinion. I could be wrong. Go get 'em.